Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistant's assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
The Athletic.
Gary tackles Lewis Hamilton's technique troubles, F1's power unit puzzlement, and your questions on outwash, paint jobs, gear shifts, and Renault V10s. Welcome back to the Race F1 Tech Show. As always, I'm Edd Straw, but joining me is the star of the show, a designer of Grand Prix winning cars, who you all know well, Gary Anderson. Just had a triple header, Gary. We were just talking before we started about the frequency. I mean, a lot went on in that triple header. Suzuka feels like a very long time ago, and that was just the start of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. As I sort of think you can have too much of a good thing. I'm not sure where the level actually lies, because once you start to have on race after race, I mean, it's nice to look forward to the next race. But, you have them every weekend, it sort of becomes a bit boring, and the old family ties start to struggle a little bit, I suppose you might call it, with the half of the family. It's not really as interested in motor racing as myself. I'm sure that happens around the world. So it is a happy medium. 24 races in the season. Difficult to do that without having triple headers. But, maybe double headers would be the right thing to have. Two races and then a 2-week break, and then 2 races and 2-week break, and sort of balance it out that way. So once you're away for 2 races, and once you're home, you've got a weekend off as such. And then even for the viewer, you've got a weekend off. So yeah, it's a balancing act. But in general, everybody seems to be doing a good job with coping with it. It's a whole different formula now with the curfew times and all that for the mechanics. It's not really the same as it used to be, where you used to arrive at the track on a Thursday, finish getting the cars ready as such, and you would normally classify it as lucky if you left the track before Sunday night. So it's a bit of a different world nowadays, but it's still very enjoyable though. I like the competition.
Yeah, and the positive thing is we've had 5 races in 6 weeks, so suddenly we're a fifth of the way through the season, and we've actually got a pretty good picture of what's going on, which is going to give us plenty to talk about. So should we talk about Lewis Hamilton? Now, what I'm interested in is you've got a driver there who's changed teams, he's adapting, he's learning, we know that. It's got a little bit worse over the past few race weekends. He's talking about needing to adapt his style. He can't quite deal with some of the car characteristics that Leclerc's having to kind of deal with to get the best out of the car. And he's accepted that, well, we can't change the car to make it work, so I need to adapt, and can I? So what do you do if you're there as on the pit wall as a technical director trying to work with a driver who has all this ability? What's that situation like, and how do you find a way to get the best out of them, particularly when it comes up to balancing up that what they want out of the car and what may be possible to get out of the car?
It's a really, really difficult one, because, whenever we look at the rookie drivers coming up, Hadjar, etc., Bierman, Doohan, they're coming from a completely different formula, a car that's a completely different package to drive, absolutely, different dimension altogether. And yet, relative to their teammates, they're all doing a fairly comprehensive job. They're doing a very decent job. So I don't think a 7 times world champion, with however many races he's won, should be struggling to adapt to a car in the same formula. It shouldn't be like that. I've had many experienced drivers come to us as a team through my years. And you know, yes, you'll always get the comments where, you know, whenever I was at XYZ team, the car did this, the car did that. That's all okay. But, you know, we're not XYZ team. We are who we are. And we have to, you know, we understand the car the way we understand the car. Now, as far as Ferrari is concerned, Charles Leclerc has been the golden boy for quite a few years. You know, he has definitely swayed the team in the direction they go in, as has Max Verstappen, for example. So, you know, Max's teammate is not someone you want to be. And again, it's the same with Leclerc. You know, he's swayed the team. And for Lewis, he's the one that's got to accept the car is quick. You have to drive it correctly. It's a bit of a fine line, this, because we keep hearing this, you know, they can't lower the ride height because of, you know, to get the downforce out of the car, and he wants to run the car low, so they're probably running his car stiffer or something. But I'd have to say that same from my point of view with Tsunoda at Red Bull and with for Hamilton at Ferrari. I would say, right, chap, you know, we're going to do these, set the car up the way we think is correct to suit Leclerc and Max Verstappen, and now you go and drive it and learn, see what the car's doing, and try to adapt your style to a car that we believe is set up correctly to suit a Ferrari, or in Red Bull's case, a Red Bull. And as we alter the setup or get the information back from our team experienced driver, we'll apply that to your car as well. So to try to make sure you're not going off the beaten track. For too many years now, I've heard that Lewis keeps saying, oh, well, you know, I was trying some way out wacky experimental setup to do whatever, and George was quicker because he sort of didn't. Well, you know, that was at Mercedes. That's a team where Lewis was, you know, leading the team. And it's very difficult, because if you're leading the team and you're leading it down a blind alley, that's what's going to happen whenever you get to another team and want them to run different setups to the driver who's led the team to where they are now. So I think you need to step back a little bit and realise that Formula One's tough. There are good guys out there. You know, Charles Leclerc is a very fast qualifying driver as such. Max Verstappen, obviously. Then we get Piastri and Norris. You know, all of that bunch are very good drivers, and he needs to step back a little bit and think, hang on a minute, it's not as easy as I thought it was.
It's interesting perhaps to look at it a little bit in terms of what's achievable with the cars, because some people listening will probably think, well, why don't Ferrari make the car have the balance and the characteristics that Hamilton wants? Then we know it'll be quick. But of course, you've then got the challenge of what's possible. So one example is he seems to be struggling with some of that rear instability into the fast corners. But if you don't have that, then you'll just have chronic understeer sort of in the middle of the fast corners, and that makes the car even slower. And Leclerc has kind of accepted that trade-off. So it's not just a question of flicking some switches and the car does what you want it to be and it's as quick, because he could have a Ferrari that gives him 100% confidence but is a second a lap slower, for example. So that it's not quite as simple as just give him the car that he wants. Yeah,
that's why I'm saying give him the car that the other guy's got, as opposed to trying to get down a blind alley or potentially a blind alley. You know, the cars are very, very difficult. The characteristics of the car, the transient conditions of the car is what it's about. And that's what you're talking there about, the rear end instability in the fast corners. The car's always on the move. It's never steady state. It's always transient. You know, you're lifting the throttle, get back on the throttle, you're turning the steering wheel, the car's rolling, it's yowing. All those characteristics have an aerodynamic influence on the car. And, you know, that's what you've got to try and manage. You've got to try and come up with the best aerodynamic characteristics. And everything, I keep saying this old word, compromise. Everything's a compromise when you're designing the car. You know, you're trying to get the most downforce out of it possible. I've always been one for trying to pursue as much stable downforce. I didn't like peaky downforce where you can tie the car down to a millimetre ride height or something and suddenly you've got, you know, 10% more downforce. That's really not a car that you want, because the driver can never drive the car in that closed up condition. So I think, yes, it's still early days. I keep saying that, still early days, and I would hope to see him start to challenge. And, you know, China in the sprint race, I mean, yeah, he was there. He was on pole position and won the race. You can't do that without actually being better than the rest, which at that point in time he was. But it's gone away just as quickly. Some of that I'm not quite sure, because Ferrari still haven't shown to me they've got the consistency they need in the car. So perhaps some of that is part of the Ferrari inconsistency as well. So I think we need to sort of, again, the old thing, give it a little bit more time for everything to settle down a little bit. Try to get some consistency into the overall Ferrari results, and then judge this. Maybe another 3 races or something. But I will sort of say that I don't think Lewis Hamilton, with his experience and the career he's had, should be struggling to pick up what a car requires and adapt to it. He should be able to do that, and I'm not seeing that week in, week out. I'm seeing it on the odd occasion, i.e. China. But China sprint race, it was like a light switch went off for the main race. Something happened dramatically there. Yeah, simple thing, they had to raise the ride height a bit more, maybe. And that's a reason for it. But still, at the end of the day, you've got to adapt to these things and get the best out of every weekend you can.
Yeah, still, I guess, early for him. 5 races in, so let's see what he comes back and does in the next 5th of the season. Perhaps that's a good little measure. And obviously the Norris versus Piastri comparison was interesting again. We saw in Bahrain, Piastri was on top of the car, Norris wasn't. And it was kind of a bit the other way around. Norris was certainly quicker in Saudi Arabia. He got it badly wrong in qualifying, but Piastri wasn't at his absolute best. But he did win, which is always a good sign, isn't it? When a driver doesn't need to be at their absolute 100% best and they can win. That's how you win 50 Grand Prix in your career rather than half a dozen, isn't it? But what do you make of that reverse and what it tells us about those 2 drivers in the car?
Well, from looking at it from the outside, I think Norris is feeling a little bit more the pressure than Piastri. Piastri is obviously a very laid-back character. He seems to take it all in his stride fairly well. If he does well, he does well. If he doesn't do quite so well, he can live with that. And as you say, he's able to see the big picture, I suppose you might call it. The best races you can ever win are the slowest races, where there's no risk in it, or you pick something up from nothing. I mean, did he do wrong not to qualify on pole in Saudi? I don't think he did wrong. I think Max did an exceptional job. So at the end of the day, it caught them a little bit by surprise. But, Lando's crash in Q3 in Saudi, to me, if you look at that, I think it looks like a bit of indecision. I mean, obviously you're on a qualifying lap. You're giving it full beans. But it looked a bit like it was a little bit wide, turning into the corner. And then he had this, he was going to go wide, but he didn't want to give up the lap. So he rode the storm and got across the curb. And, then it did a bit of a tank slap rolling into the barrier. Would another driver have had the reaction to just run wide and give the lap up? Or slow down a bit and make the lap, but know it was going to be slow? I'm not sure. It's difficult to know whether or not it was. I think it was driver error. Well, I'm pretty sure it was driver error. But I think it was driver error due to indecision. And I think that's pressure. That he's got. He knows now his teammate is a challenge, an equal challenge at worst. So he's got to keep the pressure up there. He knows that his teammate will benefit from the car developments as he will. It's not as though you're fighting Ferrari or Red Bull or Mercedes, knowing that if you get some developments, they don't. So on. So you got to get this commanding position where you're leading the team. And I think that's not like that at McLaren. It's about 50-50. And getting more 50-50 as the season goes by. So it'll be interesting to see again how that unfolds over the next few races, because it's going to come soon to the time where McLaren are going to have to make a few decisions as to which route to follow. Because you have to follow somebody. You always will follow somebody. You can't take your development path down 2 different routes. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, and certainly I think that one's going to ebb and flow. Going to be a fascinating battle all season.
Llévate más de lo que esperas todos los días con el nuevo McValue en McDonald's. Ahora puedes comprar uno y sumarle otro por $1. Así que cuando tu equipo favorito enfrente a sus rivales, enfrenta tus antojos con $5 Meal Deals. Y si estás corriendo para alcanzar el desayuno, corre a la para llevarte ofertas antes del cutoff. Tú decides, y con McValue, tu decisión siempre rinde más. Precios y participación pueden variar. BOGO $1 válido para un producto de igual o menor valor. Debe estar registrado en Rewards para ofertas en el app.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Right, let's get on to our main topic, which is looking a little bit more ahead at 2026. There's been a lot of talk about 2026 power units. There's an F1 Commission meeting which is discussing various potential modifications to the way the power units can operate. So some of you will, by the time you listen to this, know what the outcome of that was. Some of you won't, so we won't get too much into anticipating that. But it's a really odd situation for Formula One to be in, isn't it? Because it's one thing to be considering whether the prevailing conditions have changed and you need a different direction for 29 or, 2029 is the earliest they'll change fundamentally. But talking about the potential power reduction in the race of the electric motor at this stage, when you're just over half a season out from it, seems astonishing, given, as a piece you've been working on explains, the numbers have been there for all to see in terms of the harvesting potential. And these aren't new problems, yet suddenly, even the fact there's a proposal to do that, even if it doesn't go through, seems astonishing.
Yeah, I think, it's one of these sort of things where I think they're bitten off more than they can chew. And the whole package, and not just the PU. From my point of view, you end up with X amount of seasons, 4 seasons of these regulations that we have now. And everybody's got used to them, understood them. This is from a car point of view. So I do 100% agree that for 2026, they should have given the car a bit of a squeeze. Kept, just more or less the regulations as they are, but just made the car a bit narrower, a bit shorter in the wheelbase, and a bit lighter. And a few more detailed things around to reduce the potential of outwash from the front wing end plates and various little things that we've learned during these 4 years. Because, again, it's the same old deal. The teams learn over those 4 years of development direction. The FIA should learn over those 4 years as to where they've made mistakes. So I'm not a big fan of opening up another box of worms as such, because there will be things wrong with these new regulations, with all this active aerodynamics and so on and so forth. Sometimes it can be too much. Why do that? Because we are talking about a competition here that it should be a competition for everybody to compete in. 100-meter sprint, it's a competition between whatever, as 8 people running 100 meters from start to finish. But, one of them's not allowed to have an aerodynamic suit on against the others. So it's, you want to try and make things as challenging as possible, but the same equality for everybody. And so I think the chassis regulations, from my point of view, have gone a bit wild. They didn't have to change everything. And the PU is the same. It's there. It's meeting its requirements right now. It's doing its job. They're reliable. Everything functions. Everything works quite happily. So why not just change direction by a small percentage, i.e. up the output of the ERS system, the electrical system, by a bit, but not 3 times. That's just madness, because you can't harvest it. The moment we see it, you can't harvest it. You haven't got time to keep the battery fully charged, to be able to use the battery for a full lap, and that's what we get clipping at the end of the straights that the drivers complain about. It's all right in qualifying, because you can do a slow lap, charge your battery pack up as best possible, and on the in lap you can charge the battery pack back up ready for the next run. But in a race you can't do that. You put your hand up and say, sorry, I'm going to do a slow lap here so I can charge my battery, chap, so don't pass me for a little while, because that's not possible. So the racing, qualifying and the racing needs to be the same. As I say, we see too big a time difference in my book, between the race lap times and the qualifying lap times. In reality, you don't see that visually. To a certain extent, you can see a little bit of it, but you don't see it visually. It's still racing because all the cars are going at the more or less the same speed, whether they're faster or slower. But you don't want to get that too big an offset because it's a whole different deal then for the driver. So I think whatever they do for qualifying needs to be the same in the race. We need to have some equivalence going across there because you'll get this thing, well, the car is much better at the race strategy than they are at qualifying strategy or vice versa. There'll always be another reason for something happening. And we don't want those other reasons for something happening. We want the same reason all the time. So I think my way of summing it up is they've bitten off more than they can chew. Too many changes, all from the front of the car to the back of the car, including the PU. And I think it's one of those sort of things. They also, the energy lost from not harvesting anything from the front axle, which is existing technology. It's there to be had. It's not like reinventing a wheel. It's just crazy. In my article you see it. I think if you're looking at all the numbers and rounding them all up, they harvest about 22% of the actual energy used to slow the car down during a lap. That's what 78% thrown out the window, and that's a huge amount of energy. It's 4 times what you actually harvest. So there's a hell of a lot you can do if you wanted to really have a massive battery pack, but you have to change the way you're doing it. You can't do it the same way. So yeah, we'll wait and see what they come up with. But I'm a bit disappointed in this change for 2026.
It's a strange scenario, isn't it, as well, because obviously they set this target because they wanted the 50-50 or roughly 50-50 split. So you'd have thought you could just say, right, well, just because it's possible to get that power doesn't mean that if you can't do it, you have to. A little bit like with minimum weight, which is why it's strange a few years ago when they raised the minimum weight because some teams were struggling to get down to it. It's like, well, yeah, it's not a weight that you have to be able to be on. It's if you can go into a race and you can run at 350 kilowatts consistently, whereas others have to just can't, and then you can argue that well that's just your fault. And I know there's concerns about the different speeds and when you'll start to get cutting and harvesting in opportune moments, etc. But that was all clear when they wrote the rules. And the difficult thing is that although the FIA will get plenty of stick for it as the rule makers, ultimately it's the manufacturers that pushed for this. And the thing about, for example, front axle harvesting is an obvious thing to do, but they're all scared of Audi because Audi had experience of it from their sports car program. But you feel like the manufacturers have pushed for this, then they've all got a little bit scared that someone else might be better at something that's needed for it. So it just seems to go round and round in circles. And then you've got everything that follows with the cars, the active aero, the narrowing of the tyres, all these kind of things are just to make the cars quicker, to mitigate the problem of the engines, the power units. So it's concerning that you've got to this point, and all of that maths that you've just talked about, and you've done a good in-depth piece, which by the time you listen to this should be available on the race website. If it's not, it will be very soon. It just shows that the maths is not new. When they worked it out a few years ago, they could have looked at it and got very, very similar numbers. So that's what I find so curious.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are there, and I think what you have to do is start from, put the cart before the horse, in a way. You have to look at what your harvesting potential is and say that this is what we can gain on the lap. How big an MGUK do we need now to grab that energy during that point? How much input can you get during that period of time, which is braking? And that leaves you with a battery pack that's got X amount of charge in it, ready to be used on the lap. In general, the braking time to the usage time is probably, I don't know, it's 15-20% maybe. So, you've got to be able to charge the battery up to a suitable level to get X out of it when you want it. And I look at getting X out of it as being when you're on full throttle. When you're on full throttle, you want maximum power. If you have more power, maybe not quite so much full throttle, but, it's quite close. So if you've got, 60% of the lap you want full power, and you've got 15% of the lap that you're braking to recoup that energy, the big number is what you can recoup during that 15%, which is, X time. And then that gives you the size of the MGUK you need to charge the battery pack up by using it as your braking tool, and then that gives you the battery pack capacity you've got to use for when you're going down the straights. So if that's, as I say, if it's 4 times the braking distance, then you can only use a quarter of the power you've got as a maximum power output. You can make these numbers work out correctly to make sure that the cars all have equivalent power output from the battery pack for the same power input from the recharge. But at the minute, they seem to just jump in and say, this is the power output we're going to have. It's up to you guys to sort out how you would charge that up. But we're not allowing you to do front wheel charging. You can't recoup anything from the front wheel. And, at the end of the day, Audi are coming in. And as you say, they're all worried about Audi's experience with front axle recharging. Well, it's quite simple. In the regulations, there's lots of stuff you can buy from the outside world. Allow people to buy a front axle system to recoup the battery if they want. And you can buy it from Audi. It's not your choice. So, there's ways and means to do everything. But I think, we're reluctant to do it with open eyes, I think.
Yeah, it's a very, very concerning situation overall. I mean, it's good that they are discussing ways to try and tackle it, because the time has passed for framing the rules, hasn't it? That ship sailed a few years ago, but it's just a shame to be in this scenario where suddenly problems that could have been foreseen are being tackled. But that's all connected to the wider picture, isn't it? And the questions about what the next engine formula might be, whether you kind of cut back on the dependence on the manufacturers, and F1 tries to stand on its own 2 feet with an engine that it feels serves the racing demands. So there's lots of debates going on there that are going to stretch out for quite some time. Right, well, as ever, the final part of the podcast will be dedicated to listener questions. If you'd like to send in a question for Gary to take on, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com, and we'll aim to get to it, as long as it's at least tangentially related to technical aspects of Formula One. But it can be about anything past or present, something you want to explain, some question you've never really got your head around, and Gary will always do his best to answer. The first question on today's episode comes from Jack Brown from Texas. Dirty air and outwash seems to be an ongoing problem in this sport. I was recently rewatching the beginning of the 2009 season, and the new rules for that year basically promised the same things that we wanted for the 2022 rules, and both times the teams could add enough downforce and in effect create more dirty air. Would there be a way to make a maximum outwash allowance under a future rule set? I'd imagine something similar to the WEC hypercar rules that don't limit design but give a maximum downforce and minimum drag coefficient. Could the rules be written to allow only X amount of air displacement, Y distance from the rear of the car? I'd imagine it being a final CFD test before you're allowed to bolt on a new bit of bodywork. Probably not going against your CFD allowance time. As someone with no CFD experience, is this even possible? Big question there, Gary.
Yeah, Jack, everything is possible. At the end of the day, I think the rules need to identify what outwash is. And if I can go into it a little bit deeper, to me, one of the things we have at the moment is that we hear a lot about correlation. The teams correlating their simulations to the track. That it's very difficult to get that correlation, and that's the same with anything. If you're reliant on CFD predicting what outwash you've got or what dirty air you have behind the car, then you're relying on a tool to do that, as opposed to what the reality is. And one of the things I will say is, as these cars got bigger and wider, and outwash has become more important, I think one of the things that you do need to have more gut feel about is the wind tunnels that you use. Because the size of the wind tunnel, the walls can affect very quickly the numbers you're getting from the wind tunnel system. Because obviously if the flow around the car gets affected by the walls, it causes changes to the car that you don't understand. And that could be one of Red Bull's wind tunnel restrictions they keep talking about. I don't necessarily believe it's just the difficult to control the temperature, because the fact that it's a big piece of concrete, huge piece of concrete, which I've visited on a couple of occasions, is actually quite good because it keeps the temperature stable. One of the things with a wind tunnel you've got to be very careful of is because they're built fairly flimsy, let's say, the temperature control in it is very difficult to keep the temperature stable, because the most important thing is to reduce the variabilities of all the stuff in the wind tunnel. And, controlling the temperature in a normal, conventional, modern-day wind tunnel is one of the biggest hassles, whereas a wind tunnel that's a big block of concrete, as Christian Horner says, is a lot easier. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's just the actual cross-sectional area of the wind tunnel that is affecting their airflow characteristics outside of the car. And I think some of the things you can look at with the teams is that, when they put their air brakes on and they're, have them outside of the front wheels, behind the front wheels and outside, or outside of the rear wheels or in front of the rear wheels, but they're always wider than the car. They're looking at the characteristics outside of the car, because that flow out there is the flow that affects the flow on the car. So it's difficult, I think, to legislate for a given measurement of load and say your car's illegal because it's 5 kilograms too much downforce or XYZ too much wake. I think you have to legislate for it within the design of the car, as opposed to relying on data that creates more data that has to be judged by somebody who's not quite ever sat in a racing car or designed a racing car. So I think, no, I don't think I'd like to go down that route. It could be done for sure, but I don't think I'd like to go down that route.
There's also the law of unintended consequences, isn't there? Because 2009 was cited in the question. And 2009 was the point where outwash became such a big deal, wasn't it? So that geometry became so important. And that was a direct result of them thinking, all right, having the wide front wings, that's the right way to go. So you try and create one set of conditions to solve a problem, and you create other ones. Like, who knows? Let's say you could come up with the perfect mechanism for limiting the amount of outwash aero you have. Who knows where that would move the airflow to, and what consequence it could have. And that's the thing you always see, because I think it's important to always understand that you can only mitigate this stuff. It's still an object moving through the air, isn't it? And there's no way you can have a clean airflow coming off the back of a car, ultimately. No,
you're making a big hole in the air. I mean, if you just take the cross-section of the car, go back through the car from the front to the back, and just plot its cross-sectional area, that's what's being disturbed by the airflow, and you've got these 4 big wheels that are, contributing towards that. And the car's changing shape all the way through it by a lot. I was related a bit to a dolphin going through the water. The one thing about a dolphin is it doesn't change shape very quickly, and it goes through the water very smoothly. Water and air are very similar, but a racing car, if you could see it going through water, it would probably amaze you as to what it looked like. So, you can't. Do you want your racing cars to look like a dolphin? I mean, back in the old days, way back, they did look a bit like that, but that time's changed as you were trying to create downforce from certain areas of the car and so on. So you'll always get this turbulence and this cross-flow effect, I suppose you might call it, not necessarily just outwash, that will create turbulence for the car flying along, or coming along behind it. And it's again like an airplane, one airplane flying directly behind another airplane would have a fairly turbulent ride. And a racing car is just the same, you're optimizing the surfaces to give you lift. And an airplane, you're optimizing the surfaces to give you downforce in a racing car. But those surfaces are all optimized to suit perfect airflow. So it's a very... I don't think the problem will ever be solved. I don't think it'll ever have a projectile going through airflow at speed, at varying speed, in varying conditions, that will produce perfect airflow for a car following it.
Next question comes from Joel Brown from British Columbia in Canada. I'm sitting here watching the end of the Bahrain Grand Prix FP1 and realised I don't know anything about how liveries are applied. Red Bull has reverted to its traditional livery scheme after the one-off Japanese Grand Prix scheme, and the difference in the two schemes is staggering. I'd love more details on how liveries are designed, applied, cut out or painted, and how long would it take to sticker the car? I guess this is something that's an inconvenience generally to someone of your technical persuasion, Gary.
Yeah, it is an inconvenience. There's a few ways to do it now. Obviously, Joel, you can repaint the car, which I doubt very much if any of the teams do, because that adds weight. You can't just rub it all down to nothing and paint it again. It adds a lot of weight. The other one is there's professional companies around now that actually cover the car in a very thin, stretchable Fablon, I suppose you might call it. I think Fablons, there's more manufacturers out there than Fablon, but and they specialise in that sort of thing. And it sort of started in Indy cars back in the day, where in Indy cars sometimes the sponsors were changing from day to day, so it was better to cover the car with this, and then you could just peel it off and heat it up, peel it off, and put on something new. So I imagine that Formula One teams nowadays do that. Back in my day, it was down to paint, and I used to hate it whenever somebody would decide to do something very strange, because you knew it would add weight. But the other thing is the decals, and decaling the car. Again, one of the things Adrian Newey sort of taught me, or time taught me via Adrian Newey, was that the step that a 1 millimeter sticker can put onto the rear wing, underneath of the rear wing flap, is enough to trip the airflow and create turbulence and make the wing nut work correctly. So you've got to be very, very careful with all this sort of stuff. I mean, re-decaling the car is a job. There's guys on each team that do that, but it would be it's very specific, and it's one of these things you have to do very carefully, or you can very easily damage the airflow in the car. Some of the surfaces we see, like Red Bull, most of the teams now tape up the body joint lines with a very thin, what we call helicopter tape. It's see-through tape. And that little ledge is much better than the ledge between two pieces of bodywork. And also the fact that you don't want the bodywork to leak. You don't want the pressures inside the bodywork to get outside, or vice versa, because the underbody flow is just as important as the overbody flow. But on surfaces like the underneath of the rear wing flap, or the underneath of the rear wing, or areas that the airflow, the velocity of the airflow is right at its maximum and struggling really even to stay attached, so a little trip, a millimetre high, can make the wing work or not work. So you'll see quite a few teams, do back-to-backs on things to see that their spare bits are doing the same job as their other bits. Conventional things to see them do a front wing swap. It's not to test a new front wing, it's just to test the same front wing and see that it's got the same sort of downforce forces and that the driver feels the same characteristics. Just because if you have it as a spare and you need it, you want to make sure it's the same. So, yeah, decaling the car is a big job. Changing the livery is a big job. But I think that most teams would now do it with the Fablon stretched over the top of the body and put in place by a very professional company.
And I know some teams have their own proprietary paint application methods. I think Red Bull are one of those. I think if you're lucky enough to get a tour of the Red Bull factory, I think the paint shop you see is not the one they actually use. There's another one that has all their own techniques, which is all about, as you say, getting the paint effect, but with as little negative impact on the car as possible. And they've had to develop their own technology and processes and paint tech and that kind of thing to do it. So it's an interesting topic. We should probably speak to a specialist in that at some point for the tech podcast, as it's a very interesting little area. Right, Greg from Melbourne, Australia says, early on in the Suzuka race, Max Verstappen was complaining about the upshifts in the car. Race engineer Giampiero Lambiase then says to him the upshift should improve over the next 2 to 3 laps. Can you explain what he would have been feeling with the upshifts and why it would improve over that specific time frame? Would they have gotten Max to change something on the steering wheel, or just been able to see something in the data to suggest an issue that would soon improve? It's a good question, because Verstappen's always talking about the gear shifts, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about these gear shifts they're zero torque loss, I think they call it, really, because the car engages one gear before it gets out of the other one. So basically, you don't ever have zero torque in the drive shafts. There's always a positive torque, and that's the thing he's talking about. But the thing with it is that until the gear position is recognised by the system to make sure the torque stays on, then it won't keep the torque on. So you'll get a lumpy gear change if the system hasn't worked itself out where each gear actually really is, and that's why it might take 2 or 3 laps. You need to go up and down the gearbox. You'll hear them talking about doing a gear sync at some points in time, gear learning, and that's to learn where the gear position is. Obviously, the engineers can put in a set of numbers that's pretty close, but the system learns about the position of the gear and where to put the torque back on again. And you're always trying to put the torque back onto its maximum as early as possible. So sometimes that will take going through that gear set of sequences, from second to third to fourth to fifth, a few times before it actually settles in on where the gear position is and where the torque, how early they can put the torque on. They don't wait till it goes into that position. They put the torque on with the barrel shift system. They put the torque on X degrees before its true position because they know it's in that gear. And by putting the torque on, it'll actually put itself into that gear quicker. So it's all a bit of balancing and trying to let the learning system do as much learning as possible. And then you optimize, as I say, the torque reduction and torque when you switch it back on again. So that it's done with as little power loss as possible. There's always going to be something because to get out of gear, you have to have something. But it's again, gear position learning and torque application is the thing that he was complaining about. It didn't feel right. Give it a couple of laps and it'll sort itself out.
It's interesting technology, isn't it? The seamless shift gearbox, as I tend to call it, as you say, zero torque loss, because it's basically, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's basically two shafts, isn't it? So you'll have sort of first, third, fifth, seventh on one, and then the even number ones on the other. And so two shafts in parallel, two selectors, and it's just about minimising or eliminating the transition in torque between the two. Yeah.
When the driver calls for, let's say, to go from third to fourth as two gears, the system will put it into fourth gear. But because of the speed differential because the new ratio is obviously going to make the car go faster, there's a speed differential from the input from the engine to the output of the drive shaft. You've got a small window there to allow the torque to pick up in the new gear before you take the other one out of gear. If you get that wrong, you end up with a whole bag of bits. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that as you call for fourth gear, the dog ring, as such as we call it, will go into that fourth gear. That small window then allows the two surfaces that drive to catch up with each other because they're travelling at different speeds slightly. And then when they caught up with each other in a few milliseconds, you take third gear out of mesh and allow fourth to take the drive. So yeah, it's pretty tricky. But again, as I say, there's a sort of a standard set of numbers that you would put in, which is a wide enough window to not destroy your gearbox, but not the best performance window that you'd want. You have to let it learn itself when it needs to happen.
And move on to the final question now, which is from Andreas Bastanciuri from Argentina. Apologies if I've butchered the pronunciation of your name or anyone else's for that matter. My question is about the proposed return to V10 engine rules in the future. If this happens, do you think Renault might come back? And do you think that information and research from before would be useful if this change were to happen?
It's difficult because Renault have come and gone on many occasions, I think is the best way of putting it. During my time in Formula One, I think it's about 4 or 5 times they've come and gone. So, anything can happen. Would their information that they had in the past help them for the future? It's difficult to know because although we might say, we're going to have a V10 engine, it's very unlikely that it would be in any way the same as what it used to be. And I don't think Renault ever had the best V10 engine. I think what they had was the best package. It used less fuel, it was light, it had less heat rejection, many, many positives. But it didn't have anything that was better than anybody else. It didn't just have more power. It was a better compromise for a lot of reasons. And it was at a time when obviously, the team, Red Bull and Renault worked well together to make it work, as did some of the other teams that ran it. But at the end of the day, I don't think that carries forward for this period of time too far. So I would be surprised if it would help for the future. But in saying that, it wouldn't surprise me to see Renault back for 2029, I suppose, be it V6, V10, V8, I don't really know. It's one of these sort of situations, I think. We've got ourselves a situation. There's an engine in the car. It works very well. That engine, that normally the turbocharged internal combustion engine that we have at the minute, probably produces 700 plus horsepower. That's quite decent. Go to a twin turbo, it would produce more power. Why do we get this mythical V10 thing? The regulations are set at the RPM limit. They control the noise. A turbo will always control the noise because a turbo acts like a big silencer. It sort of quietens the exhaust note. But there's no necessity to say we need to change the engine from a V6 to a V8 or a V10. You can achieve a hell of a lot by sticking with what you've got and making it better. So let's hope they keep their eyes open for 2029 and that, we see something different but achievable. And that's what I'm thinking for 2026. We're struggling to see that at the minute. The regulations, the way they're set, I think it's too much too soon.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting as well that they're obviously in the process of retasking a lot of the stuff at their very base, Renault, for other projects, and that's been obviously quite controversial. But I can't really see them rolling back on that in the immediate future. But yeah, you're right; they're bound to be back at some point, aren't they? Because they always do seem to return. That's the way it works. One interesting little thing on the question of older technologies. I do remember some years ago, I was doing an interview with Adrian Newey up in his office in Milton Keynes at Red Bull at the time. And this was in the blown diffuser era, so it was probably about 15 years ago now. It feels like it was more recent. But he said that one of the first things that he asked Renault to do when they realised that basically blown diffusers had become an option again was to get Renault to dig out all the stuff they'd done basically 20 years before, because they had you had exhaust blown aero, say on the Williamses he was doing in the early 90s. So there's always a little bit of knowledge you can take, although it's not just take that and put it on the next thing. It's just those little bits of learning and things that can be applied. So I guess no knowledge is truly wasted, but whether that knowledge is actually carried over and stored and accessible and findable and usable is, I guess, another question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. You never unlearn something. I mean, we had exhaust blown diffusers in the 90s with Jordan. Fairly primitive but very effective. We didn't get into the level that the last spate of exhaust balloon diffusers created, which was using the engine like a compressor, never really stopping the engine pump, and that's where Sebastian Vettel was so good at it, being able to go into the corner and keep the throttle on, allowing it to pump like a compressor and keep the diffuser working, and then you switch on the ignition again and you fire up the fuel. So there's a lot of technology that's learned and put to bed somewhere. But as I say, this far on, as you say, 15 years ago or whatever it was, this far on, a lot of those things would be covered because the regulations would have changed. It's not just we're going to go back 15 years and have a V10 engine again. We're going to have a new one. That's the problem. That's why I'm saying, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Just look at what you've got and why you've got it and think, could I just make this a bit better?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that approach. Well, thanks very much to everybody for those questions. As I said, it's podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@therace.com if you'd like to fire a question in at Gary. And also it's a place you can contact us if you're in the industry and have some specialist skills that we might want to interview about. Feel free to get in touch because there's lots of great stuff going on in terms of F1 technology, and it can be sometimes slightly difficult to dig up people who can talk about it. But if you're listening to this and think, yeah, that's my area, do drop us a line because we might very well like to talk to you. The more insight, the better. So thanks very much for those questions. And thanks very much, of course, to you, Gary. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. So join us then for more from Gary.
The Athletic.